Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine a world without hospitals, without electricity, and without any safety net. A world where your belly growls with hunger more often than it feels full, where every cough in the village could be the sign of a deadly plague, and where your very survival depended not on your own strength, but on the mercy of a powerful lord. This was the daily reality of medieval peasants, men, women, and children who carried the weight of an entire kingdom on their shoulders, yet lived lives of endless struggle. In this story, we will step into their shoes, walk their muddy paths, and uncover how they managed to survive the horrors of famine, the terror of plagues, and the crushing power of their lords. Before we face the plagues and famines, let us pause for a moment and step inside the world of the common peasant. Picture a small wooden hut, barely large enough for a family of 5 or 6. The roof is thatched with straw, the floor is nothing but hard-packed mud. In the corner, a smoky fire burns, not in a fireplace, but in a simple pit. The smoke fills the room, stinging the eyes, yet it keeps the family warm. Meals are simple, dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley, a thin pottage of vegetables, and if fortune smiles, maybe a little piece of salted pork or cheese. Meat was rare, a luxury for the lords, while the peasants made do with what they could grow or gather. Hunger was a constant companion. The day begins before sunrise. Men, women, and even children head to the fields. The soil is heavy, the tools are crude, and the work never ends. Seasons rule their lives: spring for sowing, summer for tending, autumn for harvesting, and winter for suffering. But why did peasants toil so hard, and yet remain poor? Because they lived under a system we call feudalism. Imagine society as a pyramid. At the top sits the king, beneath him the nobles and lords, and at the very bottom, millions of peasants. The peasants worked the land, but the land was not theirs. It belonged to the lord of the manor. In exchange for protection, peasants paid rent in crops, in labor, and in loyalty. The lord owned the mills where their grain was ground, the ovens where their bread was baked, and even the forests where they gathered wood. For everything, they paid a tax. Freedom was limited. Most peasants were serfs, bound to the land. They could not leave without permission, could not marry freely, and could not dream of rising above their station. Their lives were written by birth. And yet, despite this crushing system, peasants survived. They laughed, they sang songs in the fields, they celebrated feasts with dances around the village green. In their resilience lay their strength. But survival was never guaranteed. The medieval world lived on the edge of hunger. A poor harvest, too much rain, too little sun, a swarm of pests, could mean disaster. Grain stores emptied quickly, and prices soared beyond what peasants could afford. Hunger did not come alone, it brought sickness. Malnourished bodies weakened, children became fragile, and diseases spread like wildfire. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe faced the Great Famine. Crops failed year after year. People ate whatever they could find: roots, leaves, even the bark of trees. Chronicles tell of desperate acts, rumors of people digging up graves, of families abandoning children to survive. Whether every detail is true or not, one fact remains: famine left scars that lasted generations. And yet, peasants endured. They shared what little they had, they learned to store food for lean years, and they turned to faith, believing that suffering was a test from God. Religion was the heartbeat of medieval life. The church stood tall in every village, reminding peasants of heaven and hell, of sin and salvation. Faith gave meaning to suffering. A poor harvest was God's punishment, a healthy crop was His blessing. When famine struck, people prayed, fasted, and walked in processions, begging for mercy. Priests and monks offered hope. They told peasants that enduring pain on earth would be rewarded in heaven. In this way, faith itself became a survival tool, a shield against despair. But famine was only one enemy. Another, darker shadow loomed on the horizon, the plague. Imagine the year 1347. News spreads from distant lands. A mysterious disease is killing thousands. Ships arriving in European ports carry not just goods, but death itself. The Black Death, as we now call it, sweeps through towns and villages. For peasants, it was unimaginable horror. A cough, a fever, and within days, death. Buboes swelled on the body, black spots appeared on the skin, and panic gripped every heart. Families locked themselves indoors, yet the sickness crept in. Whole villages were the plague spread like fire through dry grass. Villages that had once echoed with the laughter of children and the clang of tools now stood silent, their cottages empty, their fields untended. Roads were littered with abandoned carts, the bells of churches rang endlessly for the dead, and fear hung in the air thicker than the smoke of any hearth. For the peasants, who had always lived close to the edge of survival, this new terror felt like the end of the world. Yet, when the first storm of death had passed, something unexpected happened. In some places, entire families vanished, leaving behind small patches of land that no one claimed. In others, villages shrank to half their size, but the earth remained. The fields did not stop growing grain simply because their workers had died. And so, for the survivors, opportunities began to appear where before there had been only chains. A peasant who once worked under the harsh eye of his lord now found himself in a position of rare strength. Lords had relied on peasants for labor, but with so many gone, the value of each worker rose. Some lords tried to tighten their grip, demanding even more from the survivors, but peasants had learned something in this storm of death. Without them, no manor could function. They began to bargain. Some demanded wages instead of duties. Others moved to nearby villages where lords offered better conditions, free land, or lighter rents. The plague, as devastating as it was, gave peasants a strange form of power they had never held before. For the first time in centuries, the rigid order of feudalism began to shake. Still, survival was never easy. Hunger continued to haunt the poor. Crops often failed, not just because of weather, but because there were fewer hands to work the soil. Families grew smaller, and children were precious. Each pair of arms that could plow a field or carry water meant the difference between life and starvation. Some villages joined together, sharing resources, combining fields, or taking turns at watch over the herds. Religion too shifted under the weight of disaster. Many had prayed during the plague, yet still lost everything. Doubt crept in. Why had God allowed such suffering? Some turned away, while others clung more tightly than ever to their faith, building shrines, lighting candles, and walking barefoot on pilgrimages to beg for mercy. The Church tried to offer answers, but even priests and monks had died in the thousands. Authority faltered, and in that crack, new questions grew. With hunger, death, and fear came anger. Peasants who once bowed their heads began to look up and see the world differently. Why should they pay endless taxes to lords who could not protect them from famine or plague? Why should they remain bound to land when half the countryside lay empty? From this anger, sparks of rebellion were lit. Across Europe, uprisings shook kingdoms. Peasants armed with pitchforks and farm tools stood against knights in armor. Though most of these revolts were crushed, the message was clear: the old order was breaking. But rebellion was not the only survival tool. Innovation, too, grew from hardship. With fewer people to work, new farming techniques spread. Heavier plows turned the soil more efficiently. Crop rotation improved yields. Some peasants began raising sheep instead of planting grain, as wool was valuable and required less labor. Slowly, painfully, Europe began to adapt. In the long nights of winter, families told stories by the fire, tales of saints, of heroes, and of ancestors who had survived even worse. Memory became a shield. If their parents had endured famine, if their grandparents had lived through wars, then surely they too could survive. Hope was fragile, but it was hope nonetheless. And survive they did. Through hunger, through sickness, through oppression, peasants endured. They were the backbone of medieval society, unseen, uncelebrated, but unbroken. Each furrow they plowed, each seed they planted, each loaf they baked was an act of resistance against a world that seemed determined to crush them. As the centuries turned, the plague's shadow faded, but its lessons remained. The peasants had tasted both the depth of despair and the spark of power. They had learned that survival was not just about enduring hunger or escaping death, but about reshaping the world around them, even if only a little at a time. This is how medieval peasants lived, caught between famine and feast, between death and survival, between obedience and rebellion. They were never kings, never nobles, never remembered by name. And yet, their silent struggle carried history forward. The Europe that emerged from the Middle Ages, stronger, freer, and hungrier for change, was built upon the weary shoulders of peasants who refused to give up.